Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 22nd of March 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, and myself, Brian Gerrish. We're delighted to have two guests in the studio with us today who are going to be watching and listening into UK Column News live.
Indeed. Where are we starting? Well, the European Council meeting is taking place today. And they're talking about international tax rules. They're very worried, concerned about this fast-growing digital economy, digital companies creating value online but not paying tax in the countries where they generate this value, as they claim. EU heads of state or government focusing on this. Now, of course, this is something that we've been talking about for quite some time, because this is the road to a globalized tax system, which really began, I think, in 2013 at the Bilderberg Group, or at least the week before the Bilderberg Group meeting in Watford. And if you want to find out more background to this, have a look at this article by Patrick Henningsen on the UK column, Bilderberg 2013, The Birth of a Global Tax System. And he's saying that the convergence of the Google summit, its tax battle, and Bilderberg 2013 may seem innocent enough on the surface, but the timing is no mere coincidence. UK leadership have whipped up a frenzy in the media over Google's alleged tax sins, leaving the public clamouring for a solution. The words "never let a good crisis go to waste" certainly chime in well here. And so that agenda has been continuing since then through the Paradise Papers, the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, and now it's going to be discussed once again at the European Council meeting. But that's not all. So let's have a look and see what Donald Tusk had to say briefly about what's going on there today.
First, on Brexit. I have some good news for Prime Minister Teresa May. News that has been awaited in London, but also in all the other EU capitals. I have just recommended to our leaders that we welcome, in principle, the agreement on transition. On Friday, leaders will also discuss how to conduct further negotiations in order to minimize the negative effect of Brexit on our citizens and businesses. In this context, we will adopt a first set of guidelines on the future EU-UK relationship.
So, as you saw there, Donald Tusk making the point that the transition agreement that we've been talking about over the last couple of days has passed another hurdle, and the European Council has accepted that, and we're going to move on to the next stage, which is what's going to be the future relationship between the EU and the UK. Military unification is going to be part and parcel of that, I think.
I'm sure that's the case, Mike. And interestingly enough, we were pointed at the NATO website yesterday, where it's quite interesting to see a whole raft of changes to do with the NATO organisational structure, all labelled transition. So Tusk just used the word transition. People think they know what transition means. It's in relation to Brexit, but actually underneath the whole EU political agenda, we've got transition being used for massive change, but the subtlety is that we're never told what we are changing from and to. So that transition within NATO was such a major program that a whole department of NATO is simply there for transition. Very interesting.
Now, Workhouse in the chat box saying a new UK relationship with the EU, but we're leaving. Now, I realise that Workhouse is being somewhat sarcastic there, but of course the point has to be made. We're not leaving. We are changing our relationship with the EU, but this new relationship is going to have a greater breadth and depth than we've ever seen before, according to Teresa May. Now, another item on the agenda is going to be trade, because the EU concerned about Donald Trump's comments about putting tariffs on foreign-made steel and aluminium. But as well as that, the Salisbury attack is absolutely part and parcel of this. Teresa May is going there today to ask EU leaders to step up measures against Moscow. She is going to continue to complain about Moscow and the Kremlin and Putin and the big bad bogeyman that's over there, and try to persuade them to take further action than they have. Now, of course, we pointed out yesterday, the day before, that unfortunately the European Commission has written to Vladimir Putin and congratulated him on being re-elected, and certainly the Donald Tusk in his speech yesterday, or his introduction to the European Council meeting, was saying that really they've got to continue to maintain a relationship with Russia. Brexit is also going to be discussed, but that discussion is going to take place tomorrow, and Teresa May isn't going to be part and parcel of that. So there you go.
And the other thing we should mention is, of course, Teresa May is saying at the moment that Europe should be uniting following the Skripal case. So that's going to be pushed very hard.
Now, sticking with Brexit, quite a number of the mainstream media and RT here reporting that, well, RT's take on it: isn't it ironic? UK takes back control by asking foreign firm to make new blue passports. They say the Brexit campaign pledged that the UK would take back control of its businesses and borders. However, it's now emerged that a foreign company is on course to beat a British one for the contract to make the new passports. And this is because De La Rue has apparently been stripped of its long-standing contract to make passports in the UK. And this is going to a French and Dutch conglomerate. £450 million is the value of this contract. The Home Office says that no final decision has been taken on where the passports are going to be printed, but they're certainly heading towards this European organisation. A spokeswoman said, "We're running a fair and open competition to ensure that the new contract delivers a high quality and secure product that offers the best value for money for customers. We do not require passports to be manufactured in the UK. A proportion of blank passport books are currently manufactured overseas. There's no security or operational reasons why this should not continue." Well, that's very strange, because the French, Brian, certainly see the issue of the production of passports as a national security issue, and they don't attempt to use the excuse of European procurement rules, international procurement rules, to justify trying to send production of their passports overseas. And I think in the context of Cambridge Analytica, Facebook, and all this issue of data sharing that's going on, it's a pretty bad time for this news to come out for the Home Office.
It's incredible, isn't it? But it seems that British government doesn't want anything to be built or made or produced in UK, so that if you can give the contract to a foreign company, you do it, whether it's steel for British warships, whether it's aircraft parts. We are not allowed to produce material. Other countries can do it. Other countries can produce cars, but everything has to be shut down in Britain. The country's being taken apart. It's an attack by our own government. Well, let's bring in Nigel Farage, a man that I've talked about frequently, and I've warned consistently about the failure of this man to get to grips with what the country is really facing. And here we've got the article for the last couple of days where with everything that's happening around Brexit, Mike, we know that Brexit is not taking place, Brexit without the exit. We know that the UK armed forces are being decimated. We know, as I've just said, manufacturing in UK being shut down. Nigel Farage dumping dead haddock into the Thames from a trawler labelled HMS Brexit. And this is apparently in protest about the fact that the Brexit deal is not going to be good for British fishermen. Well, the whole of the European Common Fisheries Policy wasn't good for British fishermen. That is when all of the British fishing fleets were destroyed. And on the back of that, of course, the local communities, the fishing communities, were destroyed. And there was absolute silence from Farage at this point. Now we have got the situation where there is no Brexit. Suddenly he's jumping on the fishing bandwagon, and he's the great saviour of the fishing industry. So I'm not sure what's going on here, but fascinated to get this email today. What's it got to say? It says, "Click here to sign our petition. 92% of fishermen voted to leave the EU in a bid to hand the UK control of its own fisheries policy. To hand the UK control of its own fisheries policy and manage access to its own waters. John Lamont, the Scottish Conservative MP, has said anything less will be a betrayal. If thousands of us come together and tell the government to protect our fishermen, they'll have to act." Where does this come from? Well, I was fascinated that it's come from Sam Frost, the co-founder of Reignite.org. So I was puzzled about this one, Mike, because who is this organisation? I did a little bit of quick research. I think this is the organisation. Reignite Britain's Promise. Reignite has become a vision for an outward-looking Britain where truly free markets allow us a free and prosperous nation. Do you recognise any of that sort of language? It's got a ring to it. It's got a little bit of the Conservatives. Well, this is the one of their other web pages. Reignite has a vision for an outward-looking Britain and the free markets. And I did happen to notice that standing in the middle here is Mr. Rees-Mogg. They're partnered up with other organisations. This one amused me because they're partners with Forge Wales. And I don't know whether our viewers will see it on screen. I think they will. I happen to notice this. This appears to be a spelling mistake, which means this is fake news, Mike, I think.
Quite possibly, yes.
I'll read it out. Reignite is able to accomplish great things through the help of our strategic partners. Working together with emerging organisations, we're able to, well, it should be advance our common goals. And here they are with Forge Wales. But there's no substance to this website. You can't really find anybody to contact. What this appears to be is another vast data collection exercise, Mike, where people who are concerned about what's happening in the country, fishing, for example, are being, their information is being hoovered up, and presumably it'll be analysed by a company like Cambridge Analytica so that the state can keep tabs on people protesting. And I'll just add, are we supporters of British fishing industry? Absolutely. What we're doing is warning that if we don't sort out the serious priorities, which is betrayal by the UK government over the whole of the Brexit deal, then we're not going to be able to do anything with the fishing industry. Interesting to see Mr. Rees-Mogg in that group of people, Mike. So let's bring in the present leader of UKIP, Gerard Batten. And I have to say that I have been appalled at where this man is now going. This is part of his Twitter page. He says, if I was asked to explain this question on the BBC, I could explain it because it's sanctioned in the Quran, and because the perfect man, who is a model for all time with over 1 billion cult followers, did similar. Maybe that's why they don't ask me. This is the leader of UKIP's reply to the subject of child abuse. And what this man is trying to say is that everything to do with child abuse in this country is to do with Muslims and it's to do with Islam. And of course, this is untrue. If you talk to Britain's police officers, what they will tell you is that the abuse of children and the abuse of children by gangs goes through the culture running the criminal element. So if it's Italian and it's the mafia, they are the ones abusing the children. If it's the Bangladeshi gangs in Bristol, or if it's Asian gangs in the north of the country, they are the ones abusing the children. And in a minute, we will come on to what has been happening around Westminster with the abuse of children. But Gerard Batten's not talking about that angle at all, Mike.
No.
So this is inflammatory language. If the violence starts, then we know we lose because, of course, there's going to be a massive government backlash. We're going to have curfews. We're going to be restricted in what we can say. Well done, Mr. Batten. I posted on his site a response, and I said to him basically how remarkable that he's pointing the finger in one direction. I'll read a little bit more. You turn a blind eye to the fact that the Christian UK government closes down every investigation of its own child abusers. And I've pointed him at the audio interview with Metropolitan Policeman John Wedger. So we'll see what the response is. But I think that UKIP at the moment is being taken into very dangerous territory. Now, I'm just going to post this one on screen very briefly. You can freeze the screen to read it. But this is an email sent to me by a person who attended a talk by Mr. Batten, Gloucester Guildhall, on the 20th of March. It says, I was one of a crowd of mostly UKIPers. I was hoping that Gerard was going to say something new and I would have supported him. In fact, I was hoping to support him. However, I asked another present in the hall would you say he was different from any other politician? The reply was no. And then the person describes why he has felt utterly disappointed and betrayed by this initial talk by Gerard Batten. So I'll leave our viewers to have a look at that. You can make up your own mind, but it seems to me that Mr. Batten is now leading UKIP into very dangerous territory, helping to inflame passion and perhaps ultimately violence in UK, which is the last thing we need.
Now, yesterday, Boris Johnson was up in front of one of the select committees and was, one of a Labour Party member of Parliament suggested to him that perhaps the way Vladimir Putin was going to be behaving at the World Cup would be similar to Adolf Hitler in 1936 with the Olympic Games. And Boris Johnson completely agreed with that. Teresa May is off to the European Council meeting today to try and get further support from the European Council. This follows her making personal telephone calls to just about every possible leader around the world that she's been trying to get to support her for this nonsense. Well, in the meantime, very little is being said in the Western media, in the BBC and so on, about the Russians' actual reaction to all this. So I just want to draw people's attention to this. So this was yesterday. This is Vladimir Yermakov, who is head of the Non-Proliferation and Arms Control Department at the Foreign Ministry in Russia, and he was discussing this situation. He said that the British have driven themselves into a dead end, but in the end they'll have to answer the growing number of questions, and the number of questions does continue to grow. He said Russia doesn't owe anyone anything, and surely can't be held responsible for the acts of idleness of the British authorities on their own territory. He said that either the British authorities are unable to protect themselves from a terrorist attack on their territory, or they staged the attack themselves. If the subject of the investigation has not been determined for sure, and all facts are being intentionally covered up, while the real evidence may have already disappeared, since this has happened in the UK more than once, then it's not clear what issue the UK side has. And he made the point that in September last year, the OPCW had confirmed that Russia had completed destruction of its chemical weapons stockpile, and so on. So that was he was talking about that. Coinciding with that briefing was the Russian. Coinciding with that briefing was a report from the Russian ambassador in London, who was saying that as a result of British hysteria against Russia, Russian citizens living and working in the UK have begun to suffer harassment and attacks, and they are fearing for their safety. And then today he was giving a press briefing, and he was making the point, we've mentioned this a couple of times, that they continue to be refused consular access to Yulia Skripal, and they're making the point that, of course, she is a citizen of Russia, and that therefore the UK is in breach of the Vienna Convention. So we mentioned this yesterday, and Alex had a comment on this, but nonetheless, this is the point they're making. They're in breach of the Vienna Convention, and it does, to me, seem to be a pretty incredible situation that a Russian citizen can't get consular access.
It's incredible, isn't it? But everything about the incident is incredible, Mike. We still haven't had proper reports from the hospital. We still haven't had a final statement that everything is safe. We've still seen all that bizarre activity over so-called decontamination. I don't think anything stacks up. Something took place, but what it was, we don't know. Has any evidence been produced against the Russians? No.
No. I thought this one might put a wry smile on your face, Brian, because this is Defence News, and the headline is UK hires team to stop destroyers from breaking down at sea. This is the UK, the Royal Navy's destroyers, of course, which can't sail in warm water without breaking down. And so Defence News here reporting that an industry team led by BAE Systems has secured a £160 million contract from the MOD to help fix long-running propulsion problems that have blighted the reliability of the Royal Navy's Type 45 destroyer fleet. BAE, along with partners BMT Defence Services and Camel Laird, are to undertake what the MOT calls Power Improvement Project, or PIP, which principally will see the anti-war warships, 2 existing diesel generators replaced by 3 larger units. So there you go. They've suffered, according to this article, a number of embarrassing breakdowns. We've reported this as well. A representative of the MOD said, our aim is to rapidly restore command confidence in the power and propulsion system of the Type 45 fleet, demonstrate value for money and safeguard vital skills for future generations of warship support. No mention, Brian, of course, of the staff shortages. So even if they do get these ships running, the question is, will they be able to put to sea?
Well, we know the answer to that is they can't, because they're so desperately short of crew for these ships. What we're really looking at here, Mike, is the arrival of no user serviceable parts. So these companies are designing systems which are being installed on the ships, but the crew of the ship's company cannot actually work on the equipment themselves. So you have to bring back in the contractor, who of course earns a fortune for trying to fix design faults and problems themselves. We know that when HMS Ocean was refitted some months ago, before being sold off, that essentially they had to bring in, the Navy was having to bring in quite elderly retired artificers and engineers, stuttering over that one, sorry, in order to help young, effectively trainees who weren't up to the job. So we know that manning is a huge problem in the Royal Navy at the moment.
Okay, let's move over to Syria. Well,
beg your pardon, sorry.
This is Voltairenet and Thierry Meusson. And well, this is quite an interesting article, and I strongly recommend people go and read it. The headline is "The Moderate Rebels of Ghouta," and he's making the point that in East Ghouta at the moment there are 3 main jihadi groups remaining there: Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda, Jaish al-Islam, and Ahrar al-Sham. And he includes a bit of a history of each of these groups, their ideologies, and so on. So that's interesting enough. But then he goes on to make the point about their PR, their public relations capability, and asking where that comes from. And he's saying that all these groups have an extremely clever and extremely capable propaganda operations. He says all of this communication material is manufactured by the United Kingdom. And he cites the Research, Information and Communications Unit, RICU. He says, starting from the chemical weapons case in the summer of 2013, the RICU financed an external company to assist the communication of combatants in Syria and subsequently those of Yemen. It was initially Register Larkin, then Innovative Communications and Strategies. Both companies are headed by an MI6 officer, Colonel Paul Tilley. And he says that RICU, which is a joint operation of the Foreign Office and the Home Office, was headed for a time by Jonathan Allen, who's now the UK's Deputy UN Ambassador. He's currently leading the Security Council against Russia and Syria, he says. This is a spectacularly good article, and I absolutely recommend it. Not just for the comments on who is left in East Ghouta, but for this business of the RICU. And I think that the UK government has some questions to answer here, and we're certainly going to pursue this case. But aside from that, Brian, I just want to make the point, there's no such thing as in Syria as one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. These people in East Ghouta are carrying out Sharia law executions, beheadings. They're using the civilian population there as human shields. They are foreign trained and funded proxies. They are individuals holding civilians hostage, as I say. And so I think if we see and hear anyone saying or suggesting that one man's terrorist in Syria is another man's freedom fighter, then we've got to ask ourselves, what's their motivation? Because as far as I can see, they're actively promoting, by making that suggestion, they're actively promoting the policy of the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And you'd have to ask some serious questions of them in that case.
And those questions need asking.
Absolutely.
Okay. Right, just a reminder about the Dying for Good Health conference, May the 12th in Nottingham, the Albert Hall's a really lovely location. UK Column is facilitating other speakers at this event, so we're doing what many people have asked us, which is to help put on a major event to take the lid off what is happening in the NHS and wider healthcare. If you'd like to come, you can go to the UK Column website and you can access details for that conference here. We'll just remind you, we've got a tremendous lineup of speakers. Patrick Quanton and Dr. Graham Downing will be known to UK Column observers, but basically we have brought in a number of very good other speakers, and we think this is going to be a really excellent event.
Yes.
Also say on, where are we, on the 28th, Wednesday the 28th of March, in the Lugger Hotel, Penzance, there's going to be a talk by Robbie. Healthy Detachment, we'll give you some more details on that tomorrow. So health is certainly coming to the fore. Okay,
homelessness well, councils across the UK are going to be given a share of £215 million from 2019 to prevent homelessness. This is fantastic news, isn't it? This is Homelessness Minister Heather Wheeler. And she says that this includes £15 million fund for London councils to support their work to prevent and reduce homelessness. This funding, which is the third round from the government from their flexible homelessness support grant programme, brings the total government investment to tackle homelessness to £1.2 billion. And I've got to ask, Brian, if you're spending £1.2 billion on a problem, you would expect the problem not to be there anymore.
One would have thought so, Mike, but of course what happens is the money never gets where it's really needed, which is to help the people on the streets.
Well, this is exactly my point. So my question then is, what is happening to this money? So this announcement comes ahead of the Homelessness Reduction Act, which comes into force next month, to significantly, the government says, reform England's legislation and ensure that more people get the help they need when faced with homelessness. They say it forms part of the government's comprehensive approach to reducing homelessness, giving early support to those at risk of losing their homes. In addition, a total of £617 million in flexible homelessness support grant funding and implementation of the Homelessness Reduction Act. The government is making significant efforts to tackle this. It's fantastic. And they talk about the Homelessness Reduction Task Force. So, I mean, this is interesting because £1.2 billion is being spent. They're going to set up this Homelessness Reduction Task Force. Let's have a look and see what Heather Wheeler said. The government is determined to help the most vulnerable in our society and to break the homelessness cycle once and for all. But I'm confused because they've been talking about the Homelessness Reduction Task Force for nearly a year now. Right, it was discussed on the floor of the House of Commons in response to a question. Marcus Jones MP in the middle of last year said to achieve this, we'll set up a new homelessness reduction task force that will focus on prevention and affordable housing, and we will pilot a housing first approach to tackle rough sleeping. And so my question is, if they're spending all this money and they've been talking about this for nearly a year, why does the homelessness reduction task force not yet exist? Which it clearly doesn't. They're still talking about setting it up. So there's some shenanigans going on here. Either the money isn't being spent or there isn't really money there and this is just a PR exercise, or perhaps it's being spent in areas which aren't directly dealing with homelessness, but may be indirectly dealing with it in the future. But I don't suspect it's, if that's the case, that it's going to be dealing with homelessness in a terribly charitable way.
This is true, Mike. Sometimes it helps that you simply reverse things. You turn it on its head. They say they're there to help homeless people. If they're not actually there to help homeless people, they're there to help create the problem. Then delay, bluster, confusion works every time. Well, let's have a look at this incredible article here from Breitbart. UK court hears a plot to rape, dissolve in acid children for pleasure of unnamed top politicians. This was sent to me some time ago. The story had been circulating. There were some people who had actually reported it. Let's just get into a little bit of the detail. A gentleman, I'm just going to call him Gihan, the first part of his name here. He told undercover police that they could make £10 million raping children on video for, quote, top political people. That was heard in the court. Southwark Crown Court heard that police were tipped off after it emerged the 28-year-old had divulged his plans to an escort who he regularly met for sex at meetings in Hounslow, West London. And it goes on, in a recording of a phone call that was played to the court, the accused said, "The people paying us to do what we're doing are very high up political people. We will be masked up and it will be on webcam." Now, this is a highly offensive subject, but of course the key issue is that the accused is talking about top political people. Who was he talking about? Well, the whole issue becomes slightly more complex because what we discover is not many people reported this story. And researching reform, I've got to say, do have a visit to this site and read the article itself because they've got a very measured report. Court hears VIP plot to rape girls from care homes and then dispose of their bodies in acid. Southwark Crown Court has heard of a case in which a paedophile has claimed that millions of pounds could be made raping children on camera for top political people. The hearing took place this month, though no English mainstream media outlets appeared to have covered the trial, which concluded on the 13th of February 2018. Only Court News UK, Breitbart and The Scotsman have commented. And there appears to be no follow-up of this case and no judgment to access. We think this case is a public interest matter and will be asking for immediate release of the judgment. And they said very many thanks to Maggie Tuttle for alerting us to this case. Now, we did a little bit of research this morning. We certainly tried to see whether the BBC had reported this case, and remarkably, Mike, I couldn't find any trace of it at all. So if we distill this down, we have a court case identifying top political people as paying for the filming of rape and murder of children. It all disappears from the court. Why should that be?
I can't imagine.
Well, I think it's going to take the general public to help pull this one apart because the inference, of course, is that this has been taken into secret realms in order to protect, presumably, top political people who've been mentioned in this court case. Where is the accused? Is the accused now in prison, or perhaps the accused is now being held in a psychiatric unit where he can be accused of being mad in order to protect those top politicians? I will say that information that UK Column has received over the last 6 months intimate this is not such a far-fetched story. But we have a complete media blackout on this. So just incredible. Media on trial.
Absolutely. So media on trial event in Leeds, 27th of May 2018. Now the theme of this, of course, for this event is to ask the question, is the media in breach of the Terrorism Act for promoting terrorist narratives? And for cooperating with terrorists by being embedded with terrorists in Syria. Get along to that if you can. It's in Leeds on the 27th of May. Details on mediaontrial.uk. And let's remind everybody as well of AV9, which is taking place the 4th to the 7th of May at Horwood House Hotel near Milton Keynes. Brian speaking at that, Patrick Henningsen speaking at that, Alex Thompson speaking there, Ian Crane, of course, and many other great speakers. So do get along to that one as well. Alternativeview.co.uk for information on that one.
And some music as well, I understand, Mike.
Yes.
So there we are. Right, well, let's bring in the Church of England. And fascinating that over the last couple of days, Archbishop of Canterbury, Mr. Welby, has been talking to the government's independent child abuse inquiry. And the BBC headline here, Archbishop of Canterbury ashamed of church over abuse. Now, there was a little bit of embedded video on screen, and just before I bring in the words that the great man uttered, I'd like people to just watch this little video clip, and we're looking at body language. I'll explain a bit more in just a moment. I'm going to deliberately stay silent while this is going on, Mike, in order to just let people watch. Okay, so let's put in some text to explain this. He starts off with a big sigh and an and then he starts tapping his pencil. It's really quite bizarre behaviour. You can hear this tap, tap, tap in the background. I've learnt to be ashamed again of the church. You can't read the transcripts, you can't read the evidence, the statements without being moved, or at least you shouldn't be able to be. I'd encourage people to have a look at this BBC video, because the behaviour of this man on camera is so utterly bizarre. So let's have a look at some of the things he said. This is the detail. To read the transcripts, to read the evidence, to meet the survivors is horrifying to a huge degree, because you see this extraordinary and atrocious willingness to turn a blind eye to things going very seriously wrong and entirely damaging human beings for their whole lifetimes. I want to put on record again, I don't know how to express it adequately, how appalled I am and how ashamed I am of the church for what it did to those who are survivors and are coping with this. The apologies are fine, but you've got to find ways of making it different, and we've got to do it as soon as possible. Nobody can say it's not my fault. I've heard about a problem, but oh well, it was somebody else's duty to report it. That is not an acceptable human response, let alone a leadership response. If you know a child is being abused, not to report it is simply wrong. Now, when I watched the video, Mike, and I listened to this man's words, there was something inherently insincere about what he was saying. The whole body language was wrong. The words were coming out of his mouth. I didn't get the impression this man really meant what he was saying. It was fascinating stuff. And this bit I just found quite strange. The culture of parish churches needs to change so that safeguarding failures are as unacceptable as drink driving. So presumably in his mind, having a few drinks and getting in your car, I know there's a risk you could kill somebody. Not many people drink in order to get in a car and kill somebody, but people certainly plan to abuse children, and they do it. So I couldn't quite work out what was in his mind. So we can then have a look at some documentation. Now, this is actually a letter which has come through from the Archbishop of York. It's addressed to Robert Greene, and this is a letter which was produced because Robert Greene had complained to the Archbishop of York that when he attempted to communicate with Archbishop Welby on the subject of child abuse, his letters were simply not answered. So viewers can have a look at that one on screen, but we'll bring in this one where it gets even better. This is an actual letter from the Archbishop himself to Robert Greene after sufficient pressure has been put on his office to force a reply. Let's bring that up on screen so that we can see it a little bit more clearly. He says this, Dear Mr. Greene, the letter says this, Dear Mr. Greene, Archbishop Justin has now left London to spend Holy Week and Easter in Canterbury, and so I've been asked to write, thanking you for your 14th of March letter. You make serious allegations concerning Satanist ritual abuse. You should take your evidence for that to the police without delay so that they can investigate. You may be assured that the Archbishop will respond appropriately to any resulting criminal convictions robustly and without delay. So this was a letter telling Robert Greene essentially to go away. The church was not interested in this spiritualist abuse of children, and if possibly there were any convictions, then he might be interested.
So this is a church, he is saying that the church should deal with this problem as soon as it is aware of it, which presumably means before there's actually a conviction. But when somebody comes to him with allegations of abuse, he won't deal with it before there's a conviction. So these two positions are untenable.
Yeah, it's duplicity, it's hypocrisy. We did actually phone the media team at the Palace this morning. They said, yes, okay, send us an email, but we're really not sure when we'll be able to reply to this. I pointed out that it was to do with the abuse of children, which was an immensely hot topic at the moment. Yes, but we really can't say when we could come back. It might be the next few days, but obviously Mr. Welby is extremely busy. So I just found this absolutely fascinating, Mike, that man sits in front of inquiry saying the whole church is to blame, but actually he's been informed personally. And what does he do? Either not reply to the letters, or he simply fobs people off, go to the police, the very police that in many cases are not investigating the abuse in the first place. And of course, let's remember the abuse is conducted through Mr. Welby's own Church of England. And I'm going to bring up this book. I've mentioned it before. I'm going to keep mentioning Trust No One by Teresa Cooper. Teresa suffered with other girls at the Church of England's Kendal House, drugged and abused. But the thing which has always stayed in my mind is that when they came forward with the evidence through the excellent work by Teresa Cooper, the Church of England used a very powerful legal team to attempt to harass and close her down, and of course the other women who had come forward who'd suffered similar abuse. So massive hypocrisy and cover-up in the Church of England, not within the body of the church, but we can see it focused in the Archbishop of Canterbury himself. And I'm just going to add, it is remarkable that at the moment we have no party in UK that is prepared to take up the gauntlet of the abuse of children and the cover-up of that abuse, which we know reaches to the highest levels of the government and the state, including the Church of England. Utter silence from the leadership of all parties. And I have to say that has included UKIP. I'm going to specifically say that, although many UKIPers are trying to do something, the leadership has done nothing. And let's bring on the BBC. Nice little image here, Mike, to ramp up the image of those nasty Russians. May to warn EU leaders of the Russian threat. We've got some nice black chemical and biological suits there to add a little bit of drama to that article. I wasn't really paying attention to that too much. This is the little one that caught my eye. Radical change needed on countryside. So we have Teresa May just about to unleash a new Operation Barbarossa, an attack on Russia, but at the same time the Tories are going to deal with homelessness, and they're going to help people who are suffering in the countryside. Well, of course, that's not what's happening. If we get into this article, we can start to see what's happening. The Select Committee on the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act 2006 recommends the responsibility for rural affairs should transfer from DEFRA to the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. And we'll bring in this. In a measure also proposed by the Environment Secretary Michael Gove, the committee recommends that a post-Brexit subsidy system should give public money to landowners who maintain footpaths and allow more access to land. In addition, the Lords Committee report says the requirement for public authorities to have regard to biodiversity when exercising their functions is ineffective. What I think is going on here, Mike, is that the government is now going to exert direct power and control over those nasty little rural communities that are living life as they want at the moment. So DEFRA was a bit soft. That was a bit too biased on farming. We're going to bring in the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, and that control is now being drilled down to the local parish council level. With a few minor distractions, we're going to help preserve footpaths, and we're going to look after a few plants and such like in the community. I think this is immensely dangerous. This is like a 5-year plan now for the government to really take control of rural communities. Okay, we'll end there. Thank you very much for joining us today. A very big thank you to all the people who attended the UK Column monthly meeting at the George Hotel last night. Really excellent to see a lot of new faces, and many people had travelled quite some distance to be with us. So thank you for coming. Really excellent to see you all, and it was especially good to hear your reports and feedback as to what you're seeing happening around UK. And we'll end on that famous note. It's not enough to watch UK Column. The whole aim is that once you can see and understand what's happening, you take action to deal with this situation yourself. Polite, reasonable, firm, persistent. It's up to us to turn this around. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.